Hello, everybody, and welcome to this last webinar in EUA series, A New World, where we look at geopolitical and international developments and how they interact with universities. Today, we're going to look at the future of higher education with an emphasis on the global. What are the major global trends? What are the discussion? And how is Europe placed in this? Before I go any further, I'd like to apologize that we started a little bit late. We had some technical problems. We hope they're solved. Bear with us if there's the glitch here or there with the speakers. I hope this will work, and I'm sure we will enjoy ourselves. To give you a little bit of background, in late May, UNESCO had its World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona, where stakeholders from across the globe met to discuss higher education. It was also the occasion for UNESCO to launch its higher education roadmap for 2030, named Beyond Limits, which urges higher education to take a quantum leap of disruptive change, supporting access to lifelong learning, promoting sustainable development, among other things. And if you're interested, you can find the roadmap. You can also find the Futures of Education report that's behind the roadmap in the handout section to the right. Now, the roadmap, the conference, is an occasion to have a webinar and take stock of the discussions, where we are going and where we should go. We're not here to comment directly and only talk about the UNESCO roadmap, but it's an opportunity for stock taking. And for this, we have three really excellent speakers. We have with us Hilligje van Land, Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. Hilligje, I will say, is a true citizen of the world and a veteran of global higher education. Hilligje has also been intimately involved in the reports that's behind the roadmap. We have Loukkola, Head of Innovation and Measuring Progress Division, the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD, and might I add, a former EUA colleague, who give us some facts and figures to orient ourselves by. And then lastly, we have Ole Petter Ottersen, President of the Karolinska Institute, which is an institution that is characterized by great global engagement. And Ole Petter Ottersen is well known in the higher education and research policy community as somebody with strong visions for the global knowledge community. So before I give the word to Hilligje, I just want to make a short technical note. On your right, you will see a chat function that is, as you already use it, for greetings and other kinds of communications. But if you want to ask a question, and I would urge you to ask questions throughout the webinar, please click on the Q&A tab which is next to the chat function, and you can ask your questions there. You can also look at the questions that other people have asked, and you can vote for them, importantly. Next to the Q&A, there's a handout tabs. There you can find background material and further reading. Lastly, I should also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the EUA YouTube channel, where you can also find the earlier webinars in the series. Now, please, Hilligje, the floor is yours to set the scene.
I hope you can hear me.
Oh, good.
Yes, so very good. Thank you very much for having invited me to come to speak to this important webinar on such an important topic, the future of higher education. Do we know what higher education in the future will be made of? We don't, but we know what we can do to make it happen. So I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation here and to maybe answer the questions that we received from you. And I would like to have maybe 3 brief interventions on what is actually the global dialogue on higher education. What do we hear? What are the major challenges and opportunities? Then you've also asked what is different in Europe? What is the specificity of Europe, and what is the role even of European higher education in the global higher education landscape? And then a more difficult question: what do we need to change? Do we need to change something? And then, if we do so, what is it that we can do, and who can lead that change? So the global discourse on higher education is not a very optimistic one when we look at the backdrop of higher education. It has to face quite a few challenges, sustainable development ones. We see that more and more universities have adopted as a backdrop the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, but sustainability in general, which is a good thing, an opportunity for universities to actually look at all their operations and initiatives in a new light, now for some 5 to 7 years. High on the agenda is climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the difficult challenges that we face on that side, and then what we can do to address that. There's the impact of COVID-19. We thought that we were end of the pandemic itself, but it's far from being the case. We see COVID-19 popping up again in many parts of the world. The impact on higher education remains very important. And there's the matter of security or insecurity. There is really an increased insecurity that we see in so many parts of the world, and also the rise of armed conflicts. And thus the background is not a very easy one.
Sorry,
Hilligje. You don't.
Yeah, the sound is deteriorating quite a lot. Maybe if you just try to mute you and put you back on, maybe, because it was good at the beginning. Yes. And then put it back on.
I hear what you're saying, so is this still difficult?
Yeah.
Yes. So this is rather unfortunate, but I fear that
it's very unfortunate. I'm very sorry also for the public. We seem to be haunted by technical issues here.
I think I will leave the word to my co-speakers. Listen to them and try to get back in later.
I think that's what we do, and then we try to get you back later. So terribly sorry about this to everybody. First of all, to Hilligje, and I'll give the word to Tia Loukkola, who will have a presentation with some facts and figures.
Thank you, Thomas. I hope you can hear me better, but I think this shows to the participants really that we were having some technical issues, and you were not joking about it before the beginning of the webinar. So it is a pleasure to be here, especially as you mentioned, as a former EUA employee. But in particular, to give you a couple of facts. I'm really sorry we didn't get to hear Hilligje's presentation, because the first sentences seemed to give me the idea that it would have been a nice setting for the few statistics that I'm going to show you right now. And I will try to move the slides. Yes, it looks like I'm managing to do that. As said, I have kind of in my portfolio two different things. It's in a way measuring progress, but then on the other side, looking towards the future. And this is how I'm going to structure my short presentation as well. So I'm going to tell you first where we are, and then a couple of perhaps a provocative ideas about where we could be going. So I'm taking a little bit of a step back from the UNESCO roadmap. So first of all, as we probably all know, and we've seen in the past decades, the tertiary education attainment has expanded in the past decade. And I'm kind of feel like I should be apologizing that I'm using statistics from 2018, but I can assure you that this trend is still going on. And I've selected a couple of statistics where we can see that the trend is still today going on, or it is strengthening. Unfortunately, our next education at a glance that focuses on tertiary education will only come out in September, and I'm not in a position to use those statistics yet because we're still polishing them up. But just to say that even if you see a couple of old figures, perhaps I'm using them because they are valid as we stand today. So tertiary education attainment is growing across the world, and here you see an example from OECD countries. And this is actually just continuing to grow since 2018. And if you compare the figures to between 2000 and 2022, the increase is even more striking. At the same time, we can still see in our statistics that it still pays off to go to university, because you are more likely to be employed, and you're more likely to get a better salary if you go to university. So things do not look so bad that one might ask, why are we talking about things having to change in the universities? Well, one of the reasons why we may be talking about it is that we do see that there are some challenges in the transition between the university and the labor market. It looks like the younger generation who have the tertiary education qualification, they find they are not as often employed as the older generation. That being said, one might have different reasons here, for instance, family situation or whatever, but it is worth asking, why is this the case? Then if we go to the access to the higher education, it looks like it is quite open in many countries. In over half of the economies that we are surveying, it is a free access to higher education, or free in a sense that it is not limited. So it looks like from the inclusion side, that is one of the issues in the roadmap. We seem to be doing pretty well. But then if we look at what age the graduates start, they seem to start at the university at a very different ages. The question is why, and that is something that we could be discussing as well. But that leads to one of the things that is also in many of the documents that we see that discuss the future of higher education, which is that the population is no longer always 18-year-old in our universities. Then another thing that it links to the inclusion and equity is that the completion rates seem pretty low in general across the different economies. We're not people who start at the university, they don't necessarily graduate. Is this one of the issues that we could be considering when we talk about inclusion and really retaining the graduates? One issue where Europe is different in trying to answer the question that Thomas posed to the speakers before the webinar is the funding structure. In general, if we look at the OECD and partners' average figures and the EU average figures, they are the same. But in funding, we can see a difference. European countries seem to rely much more on public expenditure on higher education when we're talking about funding. Will this be something that we can sustain in the future, in the long term, is the question that I would pose for discussion. But what we can see at the moment is that the funding has increased also in Europe. The countries are spending more on tertiary education, but at the same time, the share in comparison to the GDP has fallen. So the expenditure on some of the other areas of society have increased more than expenditure on higher education. What does this mean for us is that we need to be able to show the value of higher education also in the future for policy makers when they do decide to fund us. So that was the part about a couple of selected statistics from our database. And now I'm going to go to the next part of my presentation, which is about trends shaping education. And this is where I would have really loved to hear Hilligje, because she was kind of starting to talk to us about some of the trends that impact higher education. From OECD side, we've been looking into this as a general question of which are the big trends that shape education. Quite often we talk about schools, but having come from the higher education background, I find these reports, the latest of which we published in the beginning of this year, extremely interesting for higher education as well. For two reasons that I'm going to explain in a little while. In the latest one, we, for instance, looked at the topics such as the growth and how the living and working is changing. How does that impact the education? And in this work, we do talk about we conclude that future will surprise us. It continues to surprise us. We make all sorts of plans and think about, for instance, what education or higher education looks like in 2030. And then things happen and we realize that things have changed. So we've come up with a couple of scenarios. And I know that EUA has done scenario work as well. So I thought I will show you the scenarios that we have for schools, because I think you'll find some of the themes that are shared in them. So we have 4 scenarios of how the schooling could change. And I would ask you as a kind of the other panelists and Thomas, and the audience, the question that if schools change a lot and follow, for instance, some of these scenarios that we have presented, what does it mean for universities? This was not, for instance, in the roadmap at all, that, you know, the people who come to university will have gone through perhaps a different school than what we're used to. How should we react to that? And another reason why I'm showing this is that I think these scenarios could also fit for universities. We could think about that universities will continue as they are, but we just have a bigger portion of the population coming in. We could say that universities, or in this case, in our case, scenario 2, the education will be outsourced, and we don't necessarily have universities or schools as we know them at the moment. Other actors will provide the education. Third one is that schools and universities will continue to exist. But they become learning hubs. It's a little bit like the schools without walls or universities without walls that EUA has been advocating for. Or then you could have the 4th scenario where you learn as you go. You don't really go to university. You don't care about qualifications, but you just learn wherever you are, if you work, if you do hobbies and so on. And that's how you go around about your life. So these were a couple of remarks that I wanted to make before we go to the university perspective about these matters. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tia. I think that's a very, very provocative angle to what we're talking about, and I think it's important to remember, you know, this is not only Europe or the Western world, but what is the development path of higher education in the world. And I think generally as well, the idea with schools, you know, if schools change, universities change. And I couldn't imagine that young people that have gone through, let's call it primary and secondary education, learn as you go, would then come in and do traditionally university education. So I think that's extremely thought-provoking. And as I said, you know, you're all very welcome to give your thoughts in the chat and indeed make questions and comments in the Q&A tab. But I would give the word now to Ole Petter Ottersen and see what is the vision from where you sit in an institution on global higher education and research, since you come from a very research-intensive institution as well. So please, Ole Petter.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this very, very important discussion and discourse. I think what we really need now, not least after the pandemic, and also knowing that the 2030 time horizon is rapidly approaching the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to have this discourse on how to shape global higher education in the years to come. So I think EUA is doing a fine job in having this seminar series. So that's really great. The point that I would like to raise, or several points I would like to raise, of course, the backdrop here is the roadmap, UNESCO roadmap. And if you look at the 6 principles in the roadmap, I think the roadmap is on the right track. But there are issues that need to be explored and followed up in a more, let's say, intensive way, and I will touch upon this now. So first of all, of course, as we all know, in a global setting, OECD is of course important, but there is a world outside of OECD. So given the fact that we are going to discuss global higher education, I will use this opportunity, in fact, to also look at this discourse from the point of view of non-OECD members, not least Africa, if you permit. Because, in fact, I just returned from a visit to Africa, and this was after I had gotten this invitation. So I made my reflections on this very issue, what next for global higher education? And there are issues here that we need to address in the discourse in the time to come. First of all, I think there is a need to really focus on the inequity in the world as it stands today. Of course, inequity is mentioned in the OECD roadmap. In fact, in the first principle, equity is raised as an important principle. But the gravity of the inequity that we see today is not reflected in the UNESCO roadmap. I mean, just take one example from my field, which is medicine, of course. The number of physicians per 10,000 inhabitants in Western Europe is about 25. In Africa, that I just visited, in some of the countries, it's below 1. Can you imagine? It's such a tremendous difference. So when we talk about inequity, we have to acknowledge the gravity of the inequity that we face today. And talking about SDGs and Agenda 2030 with the strong statement, leaving nobody behind, I think we should, with due respect here, look beyond OECD and really look not least to Africa, where the number of inhabitants will increase perhaps threefold before this century is over. And of course, if we as universities still cling to the idea that we should have a sort of global responsibility, we must not forget Africa and the poor countries that we have to include in our discourse. In fact, now I would like to switch from this inequity issue to an issue that is touched upon in the UNESCO report, but not really elaborated that much. And this is because it's a very sensitive issue, and it has everything to do with inequity. And that is the marketization of higher education. And of course, we know very well that many universities, my included, they derive some of the revenues from higher education. But I think, as many of us do, that this development has gone too far. The marketization of higher education runs counter, in fact, to many of the principles that are embedded in the UNESCO roadmap. And, what we should do is to reflect on the loss of autonomy that we experience through this marketization. It's a paradox here because many people that say that, okay, it strengthens the autonomy of universities when you have this possibility to gather lots of revenues from higher education. But I would say it's the opposite, that you in fact lose much of your autonomy. We have seen this during the pandemic, when travel became difficult. I mean, many universities were suffering because they were too dependent on higher education, the revenues from higher education. And of course, if you are really dependent on higher education, international higher education as a source of revenue, also other countries might use this as an instrument of power. So also the countries lose some of their autonomy. So I think that this point deserves a much more intensive debate and discussion, because it in fact contributes to the inequities that we see in the world today. I would like to use a metaphor that was very much in evidence when I was in Africa now. We discussed the very issues that are in focus in this webinar. And one of my colleagues said something that really went straight to my heart. Well, it's fine that we in Europe invite Africans, Asians, people from all over the world to our table, to our educational table. But in fact, what we should do, what we should ponder, is how should we bring the table to Africa? Because what we are seeing now is that when we focus on higher education in our own home countries, we also contribute to the brain drain, and we also put education into a context that is not necessarily the context under which the graduates should work. So I think we should reflect upon the issue. Perhaps we should bring the table to other continents rather than invite students from other continents to our tables here in Europe. Just one more reflection on this. There is one issue or two issues that I really think are lacking in the report, in the UNESCO roadmap. One thing is reciprocity. Reciprocity means that we should not in Europe see ourselves as the continent that sits on all truths and all knowledge. I mean, what we have seen during our collaboration with Africa and other continents is that we have so much to learn from other continents. We should zoom in on the term reciprocity, which is very much the richness of perspectives that we need in our higher education. So this aspect, I think, is missing from the roadmap. And it's highlighted by what has happened over the just past few weeks. And that is that UK, UK, but other countries as well, they give privileges to graduates from universities that are highly ranked, such as in the case of UK now, from the 50 highest ranked universities. So what they do, what they have done in Britain, as you know, is that they offer work visas to graduates from the world's best universities. I mean, I'm not criticizing this that much, but I think we should reflect on what this means in terms of exactly this reciprocity and richness of perspectives. We lose out on so many of the perspectives that we have to have on board to meet the challenges embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that we should be self-critical in the university sector. We should have this sense of urgency, as is stated in the roadmap. We should reflect on inequity. We should reflect on inclusion and pluralism. But we should be much, much, much more willing to acknowledge the gravity of the situation that we see today. The growing inequities, not least the inequities that have been widened during the pandemic. And again, going back to what I just mentioned about inequity in the distribution of experts worldwide, this is not something we can live with in the time to come, if we have a true global perspective. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Ole Petter. And I think these are topics. I think you just turned off your camera. But I think that these are, there you go. I think that that these are topics that are indeed the big topics of global, let's say the global knowledge community. Let's not just say it's education. It's the living with inequality in terms of the capacity in countries, but also the impoverishment of knowledge if we don't have the capacity to have a dialogue with each other. And this was, I think, at the coffee breaks in Barcelona, this was actually a big topic, epistemological dialogue, as it was called, bringing in other kinds of knowledge, which in Europe we're not so used to, but in countries where the Western model has been, let's say, imported and is sort of over the traditional ways of knowing things and traditional practices, this is much more present. I think indeed we can learn a lot from that. We have some questions in the chat, but I do want to give the word back to Tia and say, the world is bigger than OECD, and how you see sort of the rich world gathering of data in the whole global picture. Then I do have one more question for you, Ole Petter. I also want to add, but I just want to give the word to Tia first.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I actually agree with Ole Petter that there is a world outside OECD, and we can learn from the world outside the OECD. Actually, your intervention made me think very much of the general discussion we are having at OECD, which is probably traditionally seen as a club of certain member countries. We've recently had a lot of strategic discussions in the leadership of the organization. And in general, last year there was a strategy developed for the collaboration with ASEAN countries. And actually just last week, our decision-making bodies were meeting and deciding on the OECD Africa partnership. So your comments come in a very timely manner. This is, of course, these are strategic directions that have been developed really for the whole variety of topics that OECD works on. But I would say it trickles down to education and higher education and research as well. And we are looking into how we could have partnerships that are really reciprocal and really beneficial for both parties. And I think one of the issues that has been kind of strengthened this desire to reach out outside our member countries is the realization through, for instance, COVID, that we are on the same boat. If we want to, for instance, tackle the pandemic, everybody needs to have access to vaccines and so on. So I fully agree with Ole Petter that we do need to start thinking beyond our usual circles of countries that we work with, and this applies to higher education. So that's it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. We are all in the same boat, and we see that with a new COVID variant coming. But Ole Petter, before we go to the audience questions, one thing I wanted to question you about is my reaction was much the same as yours. We have to be very aware of marketization and what that means. Mm-hmm. But in some of the reactions to the roadmap that speaks of higher education as a public good, as something that should be public, exactly from Africa, and I'll put that article on the handouts as well, is to say yes, but here in, I think that was in Mozambique, higher education is mostly private, which is something we see in many emerging and developing countries. If that should be public, how are we going to fund that? We don't, as a government, have the capacity to fund a public system like you have in Europe. Is there, I'm just asking this in provocative manner. If you look at it globally, is there some kind of democratic potential in, at least, I'm not saying marketization, but having private institutions where the state does not have the capacity to ensure access for all? Or am I completely wrong on that one? You muted yourself.
This is a very pertinent question, of course, and I don't have the answer to all these challenges that you're sort of lining up here now. It's quite clear that, again, going back to Agenda 2030, at the root of much of what we are discussing here is another type of inequity, and that is the inequity when it comes to the distribution of resources. And it's quite clear that without the economical clout that we have in the rich countries, it's very difficult to build a system that equates what we have in the rich countries. But I think a part of the answer lies in what I said: bring the table to Africa. I mean, it's feasible, and one of the projects we have ourselves in Sub-Saharan Africa is exactly this: bringing the table to Africa. Because what we do is to invest our expertise in the sense that they are traveling to South Africa and do the teaching there, teach the teachers, which is the essential thing, I think, when it comes to sustainability. And I think this is part of the answer to your question. We simply have to reach out, bring the table to Africa, and teach the teachers. I mean, there is no easy solution. It will take a lot of time until we have some sort of equity. But we have to walk that long and winding road, I think, in order to succeed. And could I just comment on this vaccine issue that was just raised, because it really highlights the problem that we are looking at. In Africa, as you might know, 98% of the vaccines that are being used in Africa are imported. And what we see is that in a crisis, solidarity, empathy simply don't suffice. It's not sufficient for distributing vaccines in an equitable manner. And this has everything to do about education. What we have to do is to ensure that we can build skills also in low-income countries with a long-term perspective, so that they, from these skills, can build production facilities, for example, for vaccines. There is no shortcut. These are processes that will take years and perhaps decennia, but we have to embark on this road. And this is something that, again, is missing, I think, from the UNESCO report. The need to bridge or to remove eventually the technology gap, not only the digital gap that is mentioned in the UNESCO report, but in fact, the technology gap that is so important that we bridge or reduce or remove. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, and I think there's a question about that, and I'll come back to that later. But I just want to go and see some of the questions that are in the chat, and there are, I think, one that's directly for Tia, and maybe combined with another one that's for the both of you, and it goes more to the technical details of the numbers that you were giving before, Tia. The poor completion rates, is that necessarily bad? Or is it just a sign that people go in? It may be what you call learn on the go. They have learning without certification, but we should celebrate that as well. Is that a trend that we see, that certification is less important, and informal or non-formal learning? Or non-certified learning is becoming more important. And I would like to combine that with another question from Adriana Zeit. which is what is called the Great Resignation, that after the pandemic, people leave their jobs, they focus more on other values in life that we rediscovered when we were all tied to our couch. Has that hit academia as well? Are we maybe less relevant, or are we really not following the signs of the times after the pandemic? And I think that would go to both of you. But maybe first to Tia about the completion rates. Is that something that you see, that you have people learning on the go already, and completion rates are low because people don't care about the certificates, they have learned what they want?
I wouldn't go so far to say that people don't care about the certificates yet. But I mean, we do have this discussion in different regions and globally about micro-credentials, alternative credentials. Will we be going that direction rather than doing long degrees? We'll do short qualifications or just certifications. At the same time, we have examples of micro-credentials, but are they widespread? Or they have more use, let's say, after the first degree has been done at the moment. But who knows where we go. About the completion rates, that is a question. What do they tell us? Depending on the system, they may tell us different things. But there is other statistics that I didn't show because I had limited time, which does show one thing that is of importance in answering this question, which is that most of the dropouts happen after the first year of studies. So one could say that it is also about people searching for what they want to be doing, and or they are doing 1 year on one topic and then build on that on another in another program. So I wouldn't over dramatize it, but I think one needs to go really into each system to see what the reasons are. But for the time being, we do see have a tertiary qualification. It does pay off. It is still valued in the labor market. It does give you a better salary as a general rule, but it doesn't apply to everyone. And it applies differently to different disciplines. Academics, are we still, have we lost our kind of a value, or have academics lost their value in post-COVID times? That probably depends on the discipline and how the approach is, but we do still see same numbers of applicants for university programs, for instance. So that hasn't dropped yet. And the latest figures from this year show that the figures actually are continuing to increase. So I wouldn't say we've become redundant, but that is something to pay attention to in the next steps, certainly. But I think Ulla-Petter might have a better reflection on that one.
Yes, Ulla-Petter, what do you think? I mean, as I said, you educate a lot of doctors and dentists. And as a citizen, I would of course like to have these people have a certificate. So I know I'm being treated well. But is that something you see? Is the world changing after the pandemic?
Wow, this is a fine balance. Absolutely. Of course, knowledge has a value in itself, as we all know. And if we're going back to those who really reflected upon the university system hundreds of years back in time, whom both John Henry Newman and so forth, they emphasized exactly this, that knowledge in itself has a tremendous value, and that we could talk about the transformative space that education is giving us. But we also have to face the truth that there is so much focus today, and it must be in focus, the quality of everything that happens in our society. And with this, of course, there is no way we can avoid having certificates and documentation of skills. So it's a very, very fine balance. I have no answer to that question. But I think after all, that the discussion about credentials is important, and that there should be again a space for micro credentials that do not necessarily lead to a special certificate. But again, what we see is that particularly when it comes to MOOCs, we see that not only is the completion rate very low, but it is much lower than we could anticipate. So again, it's a very, very difficult balance. I have no good answer to this other than exactly what I say. There should be room for flexibility, and micro-credentials should be something to introduce perhaps also more broadly. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to combine two more questions before we close, because there's a very highly voted one about Ukraine and how to save the higher education sector when you have a situation like that with a drop in GDP, mass migration. I could add also destroyed infrastructure, and how can you save higher education in that context? I think I'll just leave it to that question. But I think it speaks larger to when you rebuild or when you build society, the kind of investments that you make, and how you find the trade-off with other expenditures you have. And I'd like to ask both of you, but I assume that this is also one thing that OECD in its larger context talks about, what kind of investments make sense. But Ole Peter, you can just start on that.
There are two issues here that we have reflected upon quite extensively, and it would be nice to have Tia's opinion as well. Of course, one thing, again, talking about tables, to bring students from Ukraine to our table here in Europe. What we have seen, and I think we should reflect on this, is that there is a rigidity to the system that makes it very difficult to accommodate students within the system to really also in a responsible way ensure that we have equal treatment of everybody. So I think we have to look at the rigidity of our system, make it more flexible so that it's easier to accommodate students from Ukraine. But here there is another aspect, and this is something that is also touched upon in the report, and that is the virtual academic mobility. I think this is a beautiful term used in the UNESCO roadmap, virtual academic mobility. What we are doing at the Karolinska Institute, and I'm sure many others are doing the same thing, we are trying to support the educational system now in Ukraine, in Kiev, in fact, through telemedicine in our case, through what we call virtual academic mobility to help, in fact, sustain the tertiary education also on site in Ukraine. So there are possibilities where we in Europe can help out a lot. Thank you.
And I would just put that over to you as well. In the bigger context of better policies for better lives, as your motto is, where's in investment in higher education? Maybe also because there's a question of that in relation to primary education, because that is a global issue. If I'll just let you round up on that one.
Yes, well, I build on what Ole Peter has said. That is, I think it's been quite admirable how the higher education community elsewhere has mobilized itself to find ways of trying to support the Ukrainian education system. At OECD level, indeed, we have also identified issues where we can help, and our leadership has made supporting Ukrainian society high priority. And in education, we are in dialogue with with the ministry to see where we can help. For instance, we have mobilized some of our partners in different countries to help with the, let's say, the higher education entrance examinations that can be carried out in different countries where people are at the moment, they've refugees. And in the long term, the idea is to support in the policy making and capacity building in Ukraine, because this will be important, that if and when we do get out of the actual conflict period, there continues to be support from the international community for higher education. But there I do want to say that it's extreme in the dialogue that we've had with the ministry and the examples we hear from the field. It's extremely amazing what the Ukrainian colleagues have managed to do and what they are still continuing to teach in different universities and so on. So it's all we can do from here is to support with our knowledge and expertise, but it really has to come from the community in Ukraine who tells us where they need our support. But yes, I don't have a bulletproof answer to the question that was posed.
You dodged it. You dodged it very well. No, I think it's a good sort of light in the darkness tone to end on, and of course the whole question of where is global higher education going. We're not going to solve that in a formula in a little less than an hour, but I do think that what this discussion shows is how the small issues and the big issues are connected, and that we speak about epistemological dialogue and learning from other ways of knowledge and knowledge that originates other places than around the North Atlantic to micro-credentials. And I think those are all extremely important discourses to be had, and remembering that these are actually global discussions. I must apologize once more that we lost Hilligje van Land, because I'm sure she would have given even more of a global perspective to this. We ended up actually being three people from, if you take a circle of where we're born, it's very close to each other. That was not the intention, but I would say this is just starting a much bigger discussion. I hope it raised some questions with the audience. I hope the handouts were helpful. I am sure this is a discussion that we will continue to have. Generally, as this is the last webinar of the series, I think it has been an extremely interesting journey. We have talked about European Commission strategies. We have talked about foreign interference, science diplomacy. There's a whole webinar on the impact of COVID, which I would recommend to those that were asking about that in the chat. You will see in the handout session again that there's the link to the whole series. So what remains for me for the rest of this is to say many thanks to the speakers. I felt like we could go out and have a cup of coffee and continue to talk about this for the rest of the night. I say many thanks for the participants that bore with technical problems and the loss of a speaker, and for the good questions, and what is left from this series. And for me, for those on the Northern Hemisphere, you have a good summer and enjoy, and hope to see you soon on another occasion with the EUA. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.